Welcome to Technology and Security. TS is a podcast exploring the intersections of emerging technologies and national security. I'm your host, Dr. Miah Hammond-Errey. My guest today is Elisabeth Braw. Elisabeth is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for foreign policy and Politico Europe. Her work focuses on hybrid and grey zone threats, as well as the intersection of geopolitics and globalisation. She's a member of the National Preparedness Commission in the UK and has previously held numerous high-profile senior research fellow positions in the US and Europe. She recently published Goodbye Globalization The Return of a Divided World and is the author of two earlier books, The Defender's Dilemma and one about East Germany's secret police called Spies. So happy to have you here, Elisabeth.
It's a pleasure to join you.
I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, here and wherever you're listening. We acknowledge their continuing connection to land, sea and community and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So you're joining me today after an extensive book tour for Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. What are the key questions you're being asked at those events?
I think the most frequently asked question is what that means. What is this standoff and growing disharmony between the West on one hand and some sort of loose grouping of China and Russia on the other hand? What it means not just for companies, not just for countries, but for us as ordinary people. What is clear, I think, from a citizen perspective is that if globalization stops working as well as it did in the early 2000s, which was really the peak of globalized harmony, if that's no longer there, which is already the case, then eventually it will lead to higher consumer prices. So we as ordinary citizens have benefited from this extraordinary commercial integration of nations of all types and varieties. And now the two of the most important participants in that globalized economy, Russia and China, are each for their own reasons not as fully integrated as they used to be. And Russia is essentially shut out of the globalized economy and operating in a parallel economy. And China is, for completely different reasons, not as hospitable a country as it used to be for Western businesses. And all of this together means that it will be more expensive to do business, to produce the goods that you and I and everybody else use every day. We will see a return of jobs, high quality jobs, and especially manufacturing to our countries at the same time as we'll see high consumer prices. So we'll see lots of changes ahead. And I think that's why it's a subject that is so interesting to all kinds of people, not just business people, not just policy types, but basically anybody who lives in a modern economy.
What do you see as the biggest issues within that framing for technology and security?
So the technology that we have today is the result of extraordinary development, innovation over the past 40 years. And I'm sure your listeners remember Park Palo Alto Research Center, which is where a lot of this began back decades ago. And then from the late 80s and especially from the 90s onwards, we had this extraordinary rise of technology, which is, of course, so ubiquitous today that we, as ordinary citizens, spend essentially every hour of every day connected to technology somehow or using technology somehow. And that worked so well because it took place in conjunction with globalization. Borders were becoming less important and almost faded away. We also had peace between the world's most important countries. And that, of course, facilitated collaboration. So you could be a citizen of any of the world's countries and work for any technology company and indeed do business almost anywhere. And that is no longer the case. The standoff between the US and China in particular centers a lot on technology. And interestingly, tech bosses have been the slowest to catch on to this geopolitical shift, because they have come to they've had that formative experience in a completely integrated world, and I think they just can't conceptualize that geopolitics should be able to affect the way they do business because they don't feel geopolitical. Well, it doesn't matter whether you feel geopolitical. The world is becoming more geopolitical, whereas more old-fashioned bosses in more traditional sectors, manufacturing and so forth, I think they've been faster to catch on to this because they are seeing the reality on the ground, whereas tech bosses, I think in a shorter perspective. Either way, they have been the slowest, among the slowest, to catch on to this new trend, and that's why they're having such a painful learning experience at the moment.
The podcast has a new segment for 2024 called Interdependencies and Vulnerabilities. Given its centrality to your work, I'd like to start here. What are some of the interdependencies and vulnerabilities of security and technology that you wish were better understood?
First of all, the components that go into technology. So the reason that we can have the just incredible range of electronics that we take for granted today is that all the components come from somewhere, and they don't come from our countries. We have outsourced that. And I sort of wish that everybody who uses a smartphone or laptop knew where the different components come from, knew how our almost flippant use of technology that is so cheap that, we can afford to buy new smartphones every couple of years, how that affects the communities from which these components come. And it is an extremely sad state of affairs and tragic story that our convenience is based on essentially the suffering of people in the countries from where the raw materials from our technology come. Then the other thing I wish more people understood is just how complex the manufacturing of electronics is. I think everybody knows that on the iPhone it says designed in California, assembled in China, or something like that, or made in China. But that's just the final stage. When it gets to that assembly stage, the iPhone, it has been through so many other iterations of components traveling to where they need to be. That is a massive global undertaking, extremely complex. And it is to the credit of that entire logistics supply chain that those companies manage to get the components to where they need to be so that our electronics can be efficiently produced. But if we understood that supply chain better and bore it in mind, I think we would just be more. We would recognize what a miracle the globalized economy is, and how that sort of miracle can't be taken for granted.
I want to come back to where you started, which is on geopolitics and technology. What do you see as the implications for global tech companies in the use of their technologies and data in war?
Technology is in every aspect of warfare today, right? In modern economies, and Ukraine has demonstrated what you can do through its really innovative drone manufacturing program, and then use of those drones that are cheap to make, and the Ukrainians make them themselves, and they are then used against the Russians. And if you lose a few drones, which you do when you send them to attack a Russian target, then it's no big loss because these are cheap drones, right? So credit to the Ukrainians for thinking on their feet and essentially establishing a whole new weapons manufacturing program, namely this drone program that they can handle on their own. They don't have to beg Western countries for it. And it's also not expensive. But then we have the other side of technology, and you will remember, I'm sure your listeners remember, that the collaboration between the tech sector and ministries of defense or the US DoD has never been particularly harmonious. Many people in the tech sector, being the globalization era generation, they feel uneasy about national security. And we saw a few years ago engineers at Google refusing to participate in the Pentagon project because they didn't want to contribute to the killing of people, and they didn't actually understand that that program would not be it was not for the infantry. It was not a kinetic use of technology, so it wouldn't be contributing to the killing of people. But how are you supposed to know those differences as a tech type if you've never worked in national security? Such concerns notwithstanding, we see the increasing use of technology in all areas of national security and national defense. So defensive technologies, but use of technology in offense as well. And that can be anything from the directed energy weapons that the U.S. Navy is developing that will essentially help deflect any sort of armed attacks on vessels through energy rather than, missiles or grenades or any of those traditional kinds of weapons. And that is a very positive thing. The fact that you'll be able to use energy in this way, it will be cheaper. It will also be less dangerous to all involved. So that's a positive thing. But then you also have more dubious use of technology in the Israeli targeting program. And of course, we should remember the Israelis haven't commented
it's alleged
on
at
those
this
stories
stage
that Israeli investigative journalists have written, but the stories seem well researched and well backed up, and it is frightening to think that an AI program decides who gets to live and who gets to who will be killed. And if this turns out, these stories turn out to be true, these stories in the Israeli media turn out to be true, then it is a really frightening example of over-reliance on technology.
What are your thoughts on the US moves to ban TikTok unless it divests from Chinese ownership?
Oh my goodness, what a development. That would not have been possible 10 years ago. Of course, 10 years ago, TikTok barely existed, right? And now, not only does it exist, but it dominates daily life in the US, in other Western countries, and especially among the younger generation. A large chunks of America are on TikTok, so it would not be popular with them if TikTok were to be shut down, because that's how they spend their downtime. So 10 years ago, a company like TikTok would not have been controversial because it was a globalized era. The only people who were concerned about it were essentially mental health advocates and those concerned about teen and child welfare, right? I'm not saying that TikTok was founded to extract personal information about Westerners, but now that the information is there, of course, it stands to reason that the Chinese government will be very interested in accessing it, which is how this then becomes a national security issue. And so I can see why US legislators want to ban it.
When we think of foreign investment vulnerabilities, we generally think about critical infrastructure, so like decisions behind banning Huawei technology and 5G networks. But many of the new investment vulnerabilities are consumer applications like TikTok. How do you think this impacts the future of foreign investment in digital technologies?
So this is another area where national security and the consumer product-led globalized economy really clash. So we need foreign investment into our companies, whether mature companies or startups. We need that investment. And as you know, for the past 20 years, certainly, a lot of that investment has come from Chinese companies. Once the Chinese market economy got going, Chinese companies quickly reached the stage where they could go out and acquire companies around the world and invest in companies around the world. And the trajectory that took was that initially they invested a lot into traditional areas like real estate, but more recently they moved away from that, or the type of the type of company investing in West has shifted from traditional areas like real estate to a lot of technology companies, sophisticated technologies and startups, and a lot of venture capital investment as well. 10 years ago, it was totally legit to take money from anybody as long as they were not criminal. And now that is changing because our government, our legislators have realized that Chinese companies investing in this manner may not be operating on a purely commercial basis, even though they are private companies. So what does this mean? Well, I think, first of all, what we need is some sort of national security education for everybody in the technology space, so that they know that what they may consider sort of a minor risk to their company is actually part of a larger risk to the country.
I wanted to touch briefly on understanding the value of money and data flows. TikTok recently acquired a controlling stake in a company called Tokopedia, which is Indonesia's primary e-commerce application. And in late March this year, TikTok Shop and Tokopedia completed back-end integration. I wanted to get your thoughts on the move to integrate payment systems and influence applications as concerning. And for those that aren't across the numbers in Indonesia, TikTok reports 126.8 million users over the age of 18 from Indonesia's total population of 278 million.
Yeah, it really is, the totally translucent human being, right? So if you use these applications, and they already exist in China, so you have one application that does everything for you, right? I mean, this is how Jack Ma, that was his great achievement, right? That he has made the one-stop shop for every need you have online, and so you use one application for all that, whereas in Western countries we use a range of applications, right? And that means one application, one company has massive amounts of data about you. And I think 5 years ago, Western consumers would have said, "Well, I'm fine giving my data away. I want to be using whatever the app was they wanted to be using," and especially with an omnibus app like that, people may say, "Oh, it's so convenient. I don't care if they have my data." But now it matters that companies have this 360-degree view of every user, because companies can turn over that information. This is, again, where extreme individualism and consumer consumption-based economies, where they clash with geopolitics, because individual citizens may say, "Well, I don't care if, who knows about me. I don't have anything to hide." It's the cumulative effect that this knowledge about every user in any given country, the cumulative effect that knowledge has on the national security of that country.
I want to ask you about the role of alliances. So this is a regular segment. Can you talk to me about the role of technology in the global economy and how it's changing those relationships?
Yeah, so technology is borderless, right? And this is why the rise of technology in conjunction with the rise of the globalized economy was such a fortuitous twin development. One would not have been possible without the other. And there they were. And what does it mean for technology now that globalization is stumbling? And that's why tech executives have such a hard time adjusting to this new world. And they will have an even harder time when we see more interventions, political interventions, like the US move to force the divestment of TikTok in the US. And I think tech executives are just, they still refuse to recognize that the world has changed. They see it as still totally commerce-based, and why should they have to act in a particular way just because their company is based in a particular country? And that view is quickly being overtaken by events. It does matter where you're based. it does matter because you may be targeted because of where you're based, and also because the legislators in that country may decide to make policies for companies based in that country. So what this means is that as the world essentially divides and countries form new alliances, so one led by the US, the EU, a little bit the UK, but including not just Western countries, but other countries as well. Oh, and of course, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. That alliance will have to include countries that are not fully like us, but are willing to trade on non-hostile terms and not just willing, but keen to trade on non-hostile terms. So countries like Vietnam, which is definitely not a Western liberal democracy, but it is a country with which you can build strong commercial links. And then on the other side, you will have that group led by Russia and China. Well, what does it mean for technology companies? They have until now, in many cases, refused to recognize that it is we have arrived at an inflection point. So that means that essentially they will have to choose teams, and I think that would be very painful. But if you have the benefit of being based in a Western country, which comes with so many advantages and so much liberty, that I think the least you can do is essentially to publicly acknowledge that you are based in that country and that you would try to act in that country's interest, and most particularly that you won't act in the interests of a hostile country.
Can you highlight any particular countries or alliances you think will be most important in the next couple of years?
There aren't any existing ones that I think will have a sort of a quantum leap. But what I do think will happen is that the sort of looser Western alliance of free trading nations will build closer links, and also build closer links with countries that are again not Western but willing to trade, to have significant commercial integration with us. So as I said, Vietnam, the Philippines, India. India is really the crown jewel in this world. Will India live up to its promise of becoming a significant economic power? Last time around, it was the runner-up to China. Now it's getting a second chance because China is turning out to be more authoritarian and less collaborative than we had thought. In terms of alliances or groups, I would be interesting to see how the Quad fares in this.
Can you describe for our listeners what you see as the security threats of information operations?
Where do I start? It's on a daily basis, we're increasingly living in an environment where people either just decide that, I can't trust anything, and if information that comes my way is just by nature incorrect, I'm not going to trust it. Or they will migrate into ideological cocoons where they only consume the news that they receive from sources that are ideologically close to them, whether that be news outlets or their friends. Either way this develops, and it could be the two things at the same time. What it means is that we won't have a fact-based foundation on which to debate issues of the day in our societies. And without that fact-based foundation, how are we supposed to debate what needs to be done in our societies? We have to have at least facts that everybody can trust are basically correct. If we don't have that, and if people don't care about having it, where does that leave a liberal democracy? You are not going to be able to have a constructive debate or any sort of debate about what needs to be done if you can't even agree on what the facts are. And so I worry that will eventually make our liberal democracies in the West ungovernable.
In your book, The Defender's Dilemma, you highlighted the challenges countries face in what you describe as response, retaliation, and deterrence. Where do you think we are at?
Deterrence is what you signal before something happens to make sure it doesn't happen. Deterrence is about psychology. You have to signal to the adversary who you think may decide to harm you that it's not going to be beneficial to them, that you will either you as a country will be able to resist the blow and that you may also retaliate. Where we are now is that we are trying to build a lot of deterrence by denial. And it's not just governments, it's companies too that are realizing that, oh, I may be targeted, I have to become more resilient. Then we are seeing some governments focusing more on educating the public about grazing aggression and new harm and new forms of aggression and what one can do as a citizen to be part of that denial effort. Sweden is the best example of a country that has taken recent initiatives there. Then you have Finland, they've done it the Finnish way for years. And you have then on the other side of the globe, you have Singapore, which has been very good at educating the public about national security threats for years. So that's where a lot is happening. Much less is happening in deterrence by punishment because it's so difficult to decide how and in which cases we will punish acts of gray zone aggression by hitting back. And that's why, for example, we are struggling to punish acts of sabotage against sea-based infrastructure. We are struggling to punish the shadow fleet, which causes harm to our country's waters. We are struggling to punish the Houthi attacks on merchant shipping. As your listeners will know, Russian and Chinese vessels sail through without any problems. So this is obviously targeted against Western shipping. But how are we supposed to, what is an appropriate way of responding to it? And how should we respond? How should we communicate to the Houthis that if you do even one more attack, we will punish you? What is what is the punishment that we are threatening? And we haven't announced that. And so what the Houthis know is that the strike coalition and Operation Sea Guardian are there in the Red Sea and we try to defend shipping, but it's clearly not working. So deterrence by denial is making progress. Deterrence by punishment is so much harder.
I did want to ask your thoughts on the future of grey zone aggression. But before we get there, you wrote a piece for Foreign Policy on subsea cables and how they relate to geopolitical tensions. And you note in this that most of our technologies have been created without deep consideration for security. Can you talk us through some of the vulnerabilities and actual incidents of subsea cable sabotage?
Yes, so I think that the most acute example of sabotage of sea-based infrastructure or undersea cables was when the two cables connecting the Matsu Island with Taiwan proper were severed by somebody at the beginning of last year. And one should remember that there are maps that show the location of undersea cables, and these two cables had been damaged many times in the past. So you would think that if vessels have inadvertently damaged undersea cables, that they would be much of the fishing industry, the civilian vessel operators would be much more concerned and aware and keen not to let that happen again. But it's happened again and again and again. And then at the beginning of last year, you had first one Chinese civilian vessel sever one of the cables, then another Chinese civilian vessel sever the other cable, which meant that the Matsu Islands were completely disconnected from the world. Taiwan then worked very quickly to repair these undersea cables and to get some sort of backup coverage going, which worked okay. It was still not as good as being connected by the undersea cables. But the point is that you can harm undersea infrastructure with impunity. Then, in a similar vein, what we have seen in recent months is an enormous increase in GPS jamming in the Baltic Sea region, and various sleuths have identified the likely source of this GPS jamming, which is a jammer in Kaliningrad. So you sort of know where the jamming comes from. You know the harm it does to aviation, and it's incredibly provocative. What we need in order for our governments to take action is for government authorities to determine where the jamming comes from. They then have to be able to show that the Russian state is behind it. We can't hold the Russian government accountable for that unless we can prove that the Russian government is involved, and that is likely to be extremely difficult. So that means that the burden of proof is very hard. And then even if we were to establish beyond reasonable doubt that it's the Russian state that's behind it, how exactly are we going to punish that? Are we going to jam Russian aviation? No, because we are law-abiding, ethically behaving countries, or at least we have the ambition to be ethically behaving countries. We are not going to jam Russian aviation in response and thus risk the lives of innocent civilians. And that, again, is a defender's dilemma.
The issues of attribution and response are clearly similar to cyber. It's incredibly difficult. Just coming back to the undersea cables, what sort of impact will the rerouting of cables have?
Yes, so this is part of the dividing world. Now cables don't just will no longer go the most geographically obvious way. They will be routed in geopolitically conducive ways. So that means that these new alliances are building will also include the routing of undersea cables. And that may mean that a cable travels a much longer distance or a more inconvenient route than it otherwise would have and than it did 10 years ago. So we will see countries like India, Vietnam, I think, will be the beneficiaries of this because they will essentially see more cables in their neighborhood and also drawn to connect with them. And I think Vietnam in particular has positioned itself very well as a willing and able partner of Western countries as they try to, and Western companies as they try to shift away from China.
You've previously said, and in your book, that parts of industry missed the start of this movement, believing strongly that everyone's investment in the global economy meant that it would stay stable. Where do you think the private sector is on this now? And do you think there are other changes that we might be missing?
So the private sector has had a rude awakening, and many companies are taking significant and decisive action to reduce their exposure. Most importantly, companies obviously leaving Russia. You don't have to be a genius to realize that it's not going to be a stable environment in Russia for some years to come. But they are also reducing their exposure in China. They're not going to leave China altogether, but they are reducing their exposure. We're seeing companies positioning themselves as, being ahead of the curve, showing their shareholders that they have drawn the right conclusions from this geopolitical standoff and will keep the company safe and profitable.
I have a segment called Emerging Technology for Emerging Leaders. What do you see as the biggest shifts for leadership from the introduction of new technologies?
The biggest challenge is how to position your company and to reduce the geopolitically motivated harm that can be imposed on your company, but not just your company. It's because technology is so complex. If you're on the hardware side. And even if you're on the software side, you still need massive amounts of hardware to operate your software. And so that means that it's not just about your own components. It's about that massive train of suppliers that have to be safe too. So it doesn't matter if you make your company safe, if even just one of your suppliers is exposed to harm or is harmed, then your company will suffer too. And then considering how incredibly massive, far-fetched, far-reaching and complex and in generally miraculously efficient supply chains are today, the fact that any company in a supply chain of tens of thousands of companies, which is what you have for technologically advanced products. If even just one of those tens of thousands of companies is harmed, then the company on the top of that supply pyramid suffers. Well, how are you going to do that inventory? How are you going to choose who is in your supply chain? This is the massive homework assignment that executives and boards will have to undertake.
Coming up is Eyes and Ears. What have you been reading, listening to, or watching lately that might be of interest to our audience?
I have been reading and watching a lot of what Helmut Schmidt has done and said. So Helmut Schmidt was the Chancellor of West Germany in the late 70s and early 80s, and he was an incredibly strategic leader and of the kind that I wish we had more of. And he lived to be 98 years old, so he had a long post-politics life. And in that life, he wrote books, he gave interviews and about substantive issues. And so I'm learning from Helmut Schmidt, and I think that's something that would be beneficial to many others as well.
We've got a segment called Disconnect. So how do you disconnect?
I listen to classical music. I used to be involved as a performer. So I'm a lifelong choral singer, and I used to sing on a professional level in choirs. Now it's not possible anymore because I travel so much, but I listen to a lot of classical music whenever I am in a city other than the ones in which I live. I go to the opera, I go to the symphony, and I love it.
My final section was Need to Know. In this bumper election year, do you have any thoughts on the information environment and how we can improve our resilience?
Oh, yes, I do. And it's just absolutely imperative for everybody to educate themselves about how to verify information. It's an incredible privilege to be able to vote in a liberal democracy. And we should all do it based on information that we know to be factual. It is, I think, our duty to inform ourselves because it's such a privilege to be able to freely cast our vote for whomever we like. Imagine somebody in an authoritarian country or a dictatorship hearing that. They would say, what an incredibly cavalier attitude vis-a-vis privilege that we are risking our lives to get.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Technology and Security. I've been your host, Dr. Miah Hammond-Errey. If there was a moment you enjoyed today or a question you have about the show, feel free to tweet me at MIAH_HE or send an email to the address in the show notes. You can find out more about the work we do on our website, also linked in the show notes. We hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you soon.